God does not exist. Let's take the position of the atheists and let's examine it. I am Holy Land Man from Jerusalem. I read the Bible in its original language, Biblical Hebrew. It's all math. It's very scientific. You cannot believe how scientific the Bible is. I wrote something interesting, and Jay will read it to you in good English.
Atheists are a small, noticeably growing minority of the world's population. They are convinced that they have discovered the amazing truth that there is no God, all religions are false, and the billions of believers are wrong. Holy Land Man has quite a few debates and discussions with such people. Thus, he found it appropriate to write several articles on the subject to clarify once and for all what exactly atheism is and what its problems are. First, we must ask ourselves, what exactly is atheism? What do atheists claim? We could, of course, ask them, but even atheists themselves do not always have the answers. We will, therefore, help them to define their own position by presenting three alternatives to atheism. When a person claims to be an atheist, he probably means one of the following. A. There is no God, the ontological claim. B. There is no good evidence for the existence of God, the epistemological claim. Or C. I do not believe in God, the expression of personal feeling. Let us examine these claims and what they mean. There is no God, the ontological argument. The ontological version of atheism makes a claim about the existing reality. It argues that the entity called God does not exist and is not a part of reality. In reality, there are natural forces, atoms, molecules, plants, animals, and humans, but no God, in the sense that is commonly attributed to this concept, i.e., supernatural, omnipotent, and all-knowing, who created the world. This argument, of course, immediately begs the question, how do you know? How do you know there is no God? After all, in order to make such a decisive ontological claim, absolute certainty is required in its truth. Where does this certainty come from? Our two main sources of knowledge about reality are empirical experience and logic. Is it possible to conclude through one of them that there is no God? Empirical experience cannot lead us to such a conclusion. How can one prove empirically that God does not exist? Is it possible to scan all of space and time, all of reality, and claim that we have not found God in any of them? Of course not. After all, God, by conventional definition, is beyond space and time. He does not have a tangible figure or form that can be perceived, unless God chooses to reveal one. Empirical experience could prove the existence of God, if we could find some evidence in some form, but it could never disprove the existence of God and prove that it does not exist.
Holy Land Man here, from Jerusalem. And I think you would like the next chapter.
There is no good evidence for the existence of God. As for the epistemological claim, there have been several attempts in the past to argue that the concept of God is not logically possible because it contains an internal contradiction. One of the most famous attempts to logically refute the existence of God comes from the philosopher John Mackey. Mackey pointed to the problem of evil and used it to argue that the existence of an almighty, good, and benevolent God cannot be reconciled with the reality of evil in the world. However, Mackey's claims have been refuted many times, especially by the philosophers Nelson Pike and Alvin Plantinga. These philosophers claimed that even a good and benevolent God may allow the existence of evil for some justifiable purpose. So Mackey's stance fails to logically contradict the existence of God. Other attempts to find a logical problem with God's characteristics, such as with the concept of omnipotence or perfection, for example, can God create a stone he cannot lift, are also easily refuted. There is therefore no reason to claim that logic proves the non-existence of God.
Domine Deus virtutum convertetur,
et ostende faciem tuam et salviarim.
Yet, logic requires the existence of God. On the other hand, some have argued that logic actually requires the existence of God. The most famous proof of this kind is Descartes' ontological evidence that the concept of God contains only perfection, and since part of it is existence, God necessarily exists. This argument, which on the surface seems strange, has caused philosophers many headaches for centuries and is debated to this day. Some support it, while others disagree. If empirical evidence and logic cannot unequivocally prove that God does not exist, what then is this claim based upon? In light of these facts, anyone who claims with certainty that God does not exist must be very arrogant and very stupid. Arrogant because he presumes to know everything about reality and being, and to determine emphatically what does not exist anywhere, while never taking his mind off of the earth. And a fool because every budding philosopher knows that human consciousness is limited, therefore has no ability to perceive reality perfectly. One does not have to read all of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason to recognize the limitation of the mind. Contrary to most beliefs, this does not mean we can know nothing, but it does mean we cannot know everything. Plus, he who claims to know with certainty that there is no God pretends to know everything, to know all reality as it is in itself, ignoring the fact that this is impossible.
I am Holy Land Man from Jerusalem, continuing with divine thoughts. Jay, please continue to read.
Atheism as an ontological argument is too pretentious. The conclusion that emerges from this is that atheism as an ontological claim is too pretentious and excessive to take seriously, and no person with a little humility or knowledge in philosophy would make such a claim. Even Richard Dawkins, one of the greatest atheist thinkers, whose philosophical skills are pathetically weak, is careful to emphasize that in his opinion, there probably is no God, not that there certainly is not. As a scientist, he knows there is a limit of what can be said about reality. Do any of these mentioned claims work in the other direction as well? Does he who claims with certainty that there is a God also sin with arrogance and stupidity? The answer is no. To know with certainty that there is no God, one must scan all the dimensions of reality and prove that God is not in any of them. But to know for sure that there is a God, all it takes is to find one proof of its existence. This can be a logical proof or an empirical proof through his revelation, an encounter with him, and so on. At this point, we will not go into the question of whether there is indeed such proof. What is important is that theoretically, God can be proved to exist, but there is no theoretical possibility of proving that he does not exist. Therefore, he who claims with certainty that God does not exist is necessarily foolish and arrogant, while he who claims with certainty that God does exist may theoretically have a justification for his claim, so that he is not necessarily foolish or arrogant, though he still might be one or the other, or even both. If we compare the question of the existence of God to that of the existence of aliens, we find a similar analogy. No man can claim with certainty that...
And that will conclude our Shabbat Sunday service from Jerusalem. I'm Holy Land Man, and I'm sending my blessings to you. And thank you, Jay, for reading it so clearly.